Well, that didn't go quite as expected. We had a false start there for just a moment, but here we are again. And hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don, and I do this program every weekday at noon Central Time, and I very much enjoy talking to you in this program. And if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you will know that you can type your questions or comments directly on whatever platform you may be watching on, and I will see them here in my chat room and we can talk directly. And this week, I am talking quite a bit about spirits, about mediumship, about the fall of the year, and that time of year that we start to think of these issues. And hello to Ravenwolf in the chat room, and hello to Katrina in the chat room. It's good to see you both. And hello to Janet in the chat room. It's always good to see all of you. I very much enjoy this time of day. Yesterday we talked about the Sabbats, Mabon and Samhain, and to a lesser extent Yule, that deal with the end of the wheel of the year and the end of the yearly days, so to speak, with Mabon being dusk, Samhain being the beginning of the night, and Yule being midnight. And hello to Renee in the chat room, hello to Raven in the chat room. And how this also reflects on our own lives, that when we look at these Sabbats, we're also looking at the latter part of our lives, moving into old age. And these are things that, that we think about at this time of year. At least at a certain point in life we do. And it also is a time that we focus on the ancestors, the spirits, the spirit guides, and the spirit world. And so we're going to be talking about some of those subjects. One of the things I wanted to talk about today was the nature of spirit. And I mentioned also yesterday I'm working on a couple of new books. One of them has to do with the idea of conscious incarnation and world walking in that context, and what conscious incarnation is, how you practice it, how you know if you've done it correctly. And in the Corellian tradition, conscious incarnation has been a major thing. And conscious incarnation is the intentional rebirth into circumstances favorable to carry on from where you left off, together with a certain amount of memory connected to this. And how this works requires explanation of the way the spirit works. And in fact, I've often had, without even touching on this subject, I've had the question from people, how can you have both the concept of reincarnation and the concept of ancestors? And the answer to that is actually quite simple. And so many of these different subjects depend upon it. And that answer is that the soul or spirit, arguably when we talk about the seven planes, the soul is a very particular part of spirit. And hello to Bugio in the chat room. It's good to see you. But when we talk about spirit, we're not just talking about a bigger impression of ourselves. We're talking about something much more than just our current consciousness. It's natural, since our experience in this life focuses on the consciousness that we have, that we might think of that as being all we would ever have. But that is not all that the spirit is. The spirit, depending on where you're looking at it from, can be much, much more complex than this. One of the earliest teachings that I remember being taught in metaphysics had to do with the idea of the seven planes. And at the time, I could not understand it, but I was probably 10 years old. And in fact, the reference to it comes out of Doreen Valente's ABC of Witchcraft. But it was the idea that if you look at the seven planes, those that you've already passed through, you can perceive with no problem, because they are things you have already done, things that you have become greater than. Those you have not, you cannot see. It doesn't mean they're not there. They're right there with you where you are, but you cannot see them. It took me a while to be able to understand that concept, partly because I was 10. But when we talk about the soul, we have the same thing. We can easily understand our physical self, our emotional self, our mental self. But as we pass through each of those different planes, our understanding was different from what it is today as we move from the mental to the astral plane. And the farther we go, certainly the more we will understand in our development. And in fact, Ravenwolf has a question in the chat room. Can a spirit/soul share a body with someone they are tied to? For example, would it be possible for two spirits to share one body? We're going to come back to this, but it is exactly where I'm heading. And hello to Mary in the chat room. It's good to see you, Mary. When we look at the soul, it's not just our conscious mind. The soul has many expressions within it, many lives it's already led, many variations on those lives, because if you believe in probabilities, you believe each life has many variations. And they all continue to exist within the soul. At the same time, the soul also reincarnates and continues to make more variations on this. If you believe that time is actually simultaneous and that our understanding of time is how we segregate these experiences in ways we can understand, then not only does all of this exist, but it all exists at once. And when you work with higher spiritual ideas, you come to have an understanding of how this can be, but it's very hard to understand before you get there. But it has everything to do with some of the things that we would say about how we can have both reincarnation and ancestors. Now, to go directly to Ravenwolf's question, Ravenwolf is asking if two spirits can share one body. My answer to that is that at a general level, I think the answer to that is no. But I do think it's possible for one spirit to be closely connected to another in such a way that they're sort of hitching a ride. And it could give you the impression that you share a body when you're actually sharing experiences. But I also believe, and this is why I said we were going to come back to it, that while I don't exactly believe two spirits can share one body, I do believe that one spirit can have many, many bodies all at once because of the way that we actually reincarnate. Now, you have to understand the concept of the monad to understand this thoroughly. As we go through incarnations, our souls sometimes split into multiple souls. They're still part of the same monad or soul family, but they go their own different ways. But an argument could be made that where we make that differentiation is arbitrary. In some ways, they're still the same, at least particularly in the immediate split. At later points, they become more separate. But this is why a soul can be both an ancestor and already reincarnated, possibly more than once. And this is the idea of conscious incarnation. And, I would point to my grandmother, Mabel, as someone who I believe has been reincarnated more than once. And the different incarnations of her that I have met share certain things in common and in some ways are very different, which you would expect from a new life. because every life is still different, even for a conscious incarnate. New things come in through new experiences. Um, my mother is another who I believe has been reincarnated more than once. And most Corellian ancestors, we have that point of view. Um, I don't know if I've talked about it here. I have talked about it in my Patreon, and we talk about it in Third Degree. The idea that Caroline, for example, who founded the Corellian tradition, has been reincarnated a number of different times. This is both a natural thing that happens, but when you add conscious incarnation to it, it takes on certain specific things. Conscious incarnation is the deliberate attempt to basically extend your life through multiple incarnations. It's very much along the same lines as a Tibetan Tulku, such as the Dalai Lama. And the idea is that you pick up the same projects that you have. Often you have the same talents that you previously had. To some extent, you may bring through some of the same memories. You definitely bring through the same connections. What you don't have is perfect memory, and that is not really to be expected. But, I have to tell you, having reached this point in my life, we don't even maintain that through one life. But as we consciously reincarnate, we pick up all these things that we had put down at the end of the last life and start them over again. This is how I could be a high priest and then an archpriest while still a teenager. And be considered credible by people who are much older than myself, because I was pulling through those talents. And people who are not conscious incarnates do this same thing all the time. You'll hear people who have Mozart is a perfect example of someone who, while a child, brought through tremendous abilities in music that, from a reincarnational point, we would say he was pulling through these talents he had amassed in a previous lifetime. And this is something that souls do. But when you're a conscious incarnate, it's more intentional at both a conscious and a soul level. One of the things I do have to warn people about with the idea of conscious incarnation is that the more you divide your soul and are reincarnated, it does tend to be a little taxing on the soul at times. Very much like when you learn a new psychic ability, it can at first, or a new physical ability, it can at first be taxing on your system, and then you develop the strength to go forward with it. So it's not like a permanent thing, but it can be an issue. Another thing you'll see in conscious incarnates is that some of them, just as we were talking about chakras, I think just yesterday, that each chakra has multiple different points within it, and different people will sometimes develop different ones, which gives them the impression that their chakra is located slightly differently, when it's actually just a different part of the chakra that they're most aware of. The different incarnations of the soul will sometimes pick up certain qualities more strongly than others. An example being that I have been taught most of my life that Lady Crystal and I are both aspects of the same soul, and we have an awful lot in common, including a lot of the same skills. But if you look at our lives, we use them in very different ways. And that's only to some extent to be expected. And so when you look at conscious incarnates and you're attempting to identify someone as a conscious incarnate, which is something that we work with much more consciously now than, say, 50 years ago, you can't expect them to be an exact duplicate of who they previously were, both because the soul may have chosen to develop different aspects in the new life, and also because there'll be new experiences. Certain aspects of my life took on the traits they took on because of my father and his particular problems, which gave me certain behaviors in response to it. I was also always taught that I was also the reincarnation of my sister. Now the original idea was to be Lady Crystal and my sister Linda. And she had similar interactions with my father. So those differences in how I express the soul have that very obvious cause to them. So when you look at a conscious incarnate, well, there's a famous example from the story of the Dalai Lama. I think it was the sixth Dalai Lama, who was ultimately declared not to be the actual Dalai Lama, partly because he had an interest in erotic love poetry, rather than being very ascetic. But my inclination would be to say after 6 lives as an ascetic monk, I can see why you might have an interest in erotic love poetry. I'm not entirely sure that I would take it quite that same way. I think that the different things we go through do make different experiences in how we express ourselves. Now, Bujillo says, on some level, we are all the same person incarnated in different forms at different points in the progression. And yes, I do agree with that. That's very much a Corellian teaching, that ultimately everything that exists is the same power in different incarnations. And it's a matter of where you look at it from. I was talking earlier about how we look at different parts of ourselves from different places in the planes of existence. And this is part of that. So when we talk about things like conscious incarnation and the idea of a sequential line of incarnations with splits and everything else, and variations and everything else, we're looking at it from the point of view of the astral / mental plane. If you go up to the monadic plane, you might see it very differently. If you're trying to see it from the divine level, you would see it very differently. But in terms of what's useful in this life, this is, I think, an important way of seeing it. Now, Ravenwolf says, when I channel and deliver oracle message, I feel that the ancestor I bring through continues to drive long after I end the session. So I sense the personality continuously. Yeah. One of the things, I did past life work through much of my career as a psychic. And I remember the first time I got the message that someone's past life was available to them as a spirit guide and being amazed by that concept. But every past life you have continues to have a legitimacy in that astral portion of your soul, in that monadic portion of your being, if it's called upon. In this, I agree with the ancient Egyptians who believed what's remembered lives, that if a person's name is remembered after their death, they can still be called upon, they can still manifest themselves in this world. So one of the reasons I strongly disagree with those people who think that the ancient Egyptians would be upset that their tombs have been disturbed, on the contrary, it's allowed them re-entry as spirits into a world that had otherwise completely forgotten them. I think they would, in fact, be rather pleased by it. I'm also under the impression, and I think they were under the same impression, that the physical items they placed in their tombs took on an astral level in their afterlife, so that those physical items are no longer necessary to them after such a long period of time. But this is also part of how we look at the soul. When you bring through an ancestor or a spirit guide, or however you want to look at them, they can continue to talk to you as long as you're willing to talk to them, and sometimes longer. And sometimes you will find that a spirit you never had a connection with in this life, or don't know your connection with, will become a spirit guide to you. I've talked sometimes about how when I was younger, we had a Lady Crystal and I were working together at this time. We had a spirit guide named Jack, who had died in a house fire. And we had no conscious connection to this person whatsoever. But there he was, acting as a spirit guide to us for about 6 months, give or take, which is usually what you get with a temporary spirit guide. It may have been a little longer. And he had a lot of very interesting things to say. Um, in his life, he had also been highly spiritually aware, but hadn't done nearly as much with it as he would have liked to. And so he was partly there to encourage us to do more. Um, I have to say, if anything, as I enter the last portion of my life, I wish I had done still more than I have done. Um, but I'm not quite sure where I would have put it at the same time. But there's still time ahead, and we'll see what happens. But looking back today, I would wonder if Jack had been a parallel expression of one of our souls. And there's some reason, I think, um, to believe that now, looking back. Another thing we experienced, which is a little rambly for our subject, but it occurs to me just now, we had another spirit guide at that time that we worked with. One, possibly two, who were actually still living while we were working with them. I do not believe for 10 seconds their conscious mind knew any of this was happening, but their higher self was already active as a spirit guide. And I don't particularly doubt this because the things they said were very accurate. I say one, possibly two, because we were never completely sure on whether one of them actually was alive or not, in the sense of being in this plane. Of course, those who are in the other plane are still alive, they're just alive very differently. But when you work with spirits and spirit guides, every now and then, if you do a lot of it, you may find someone who is actually still incarnated, but part of them is able to act as a guide. And I think that generally speaking, again, I don't think their conscious mind is aware of it. And I found this has been something I've experienced in my own life, even very early in life. I had people telling me they would see me in their meditations. I remember very early in my career as a professional psychic, I had a lady tell me that she had seen me walk into a meditation class she had done the week before. She had never met me until the day she was telling me this. So at least at certain points in my life, I believe that I have done this also. And I certainly expect that when the time comes for me to transition into spirit, I will join the ancestors and continue to work as a guide. Of course, we'll see what happens when it happens. But that would be my expectation from having done it throughout my whole life. But, when you do this kind of work, you find things are far more complex, at least if you're working with the complex practices, than what most people take them to be. It's like the idea of karma. A lot of people like to look at karma as being just action and repayment. And there are certain historical groups that did look at karma somewhat that way. There are also other historical groups that looked at it very differently. I have come to look at karma as being about attachment. And, this is a more complex way of looking at karma. And for a person who is expecting karma to fill the role of divine judgment, it's perhaps less satisfying, but I think it's more accurate. And that's true with so many things in this work. As you start to deal with the deeper concepts, they're not always simple by any means. And sometimes they're not always as satisfying as those simpler answers had been. Though I think if you work with them farther and longer, they become more satisfying as you come to understand them better. And these are some of the things that I'm hoping to put into the books that I'm working on now. Some of the experience I want to remark upon. I had a question in last night's chat in my Patreon. And by the way, if you're not familiar with my Patreon, you can see it on the screen. You'll find it at revdonlewis.com. But we talk about this thing often in the chat room on Monday nights, this sort of situation. Um, and I had the question, how can you tell if what you're getting is an actual message versus your imagination? And this actually directly pertains to what we've just been describing, the simple answer versus the more accurate answer. Um, it would be lovely if there was a simple answer to that question. In my experience, there is, but only after you've learned the complex one. It's like channeling. I was always told, if you just let go and let it happen, it's the easiest thing in the world. And it absolutely was not the easiest thing in the world for me to learn. I had to work very, very hard to finally learn it. And then when I learned it, I realized, oh my God, if I could have just let go and let it happen, it was the easiest thing in the world. But until you know, you don't know. And it's the same with this. How can you tell the difference between if a message is your imagination versus if it's real? And the answer is experience. If you do this kind of work, you will come to understand that you're getting accurate messages because you'll see them play out. But when you first start, and I would say for about 2 weeks or so, it's not a long period of time, I don't think. But at first you have to kind of take it on faith because you won't yet know how to tell the difference. Now, once you've learned that, yes, you're getting accurate messages, there can be a certain physical feeling that you'll learn to identify. So that is a simple answer, but you're not going to be able to identify it until you first have realized you're bringing through accurate messages. I will say one way to tell the accuracy of your messages versus your imagination is how much of you is still there when you're getting them. The less of you that's there, the more that's coming through. And I've remarked on occasion that when you bring through oracular messages, you don't normally remember any part of it unless possibly you discuss it immediately after coming out of the trance, or there's a recording you can look at. And that's because your conscious mind largely is no longer there, even if you don't actually lose consciousness. But it's not your messages. You won't remember them. That's one of the ways you can tell. But you have to have a certain amount of skill before you come to that place. Now, when I first started doing clairvoyant / channeled messages, and in the end, it's basically the same skill, just at different levels of immersion. The very first thing I got, and I've talked about this before even on this program, were flowers opening in my third eye and sometimes in my throat. And they opened in the form of, what did they call it? It's where the film would be sped up and you could see the flower open very suddenly. Now that our technology has changed, you don't hear the term for it so often, but it used to be a common term. But what I would see is I would see those flowers opening within those chakras. I had no idea why. 20 years later, I found out these were yoga exercises. I didn't know. If I'd known that then, I'd have known I was getting accurate messages because I didn't know what it was. Another thing that happened to me is when I was early in my channeling career, my body would do certain things. For example, my head would rock back and forth or move around in a circle at times. And I just said, that's what the energy does as it's coming through. I've come to find that some of those things are also related to yoga or other forms of metaphysical work, which I never knew at the time. So this is one of the ways. Time-lapse photography. Thank you, Buhio. That's exactly the word I was looking for. And hello to Sandra from the Netherlands. It's good to see you, Sandra. And I see that, that we've come to the end of our half hour. So I'm going to have our prayer and then say goodbye for the day. But I'll be back tomorrow and I'll be talking about this same subject again, probably a slightly different aspect of it. But this week, this is my intention for my topic. So my last point before the prayer, if you'd be interested in having a reading with me as we head into the closing part of the year, feel free to message me through Facebook or Instagram, or look me up on AOL.com at donlewishp@AOL.com and send me an email, and we could set up a reading. I can read on whatever you want to know about your current life or past lives or spirit guides or all kinds of different things. So that's my little plug before the end of the program. And now let us have our prayer as we commonly do. And beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we rejoice in this world you have given us. We rejoice in all the many manifestations that we are able to take as emanations of spirit. We know that we are all related ultimately. And we know that as above, so below refers to the fact that we are all emanations of deity. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for this knowledge. We thank you for all that you do for us in our lives. And we thank you for your presence, knowing you are always with us, but from respect. We thank you for being here, and may you be blessed now and always. And may you be blessed now and always, and I will see you tomorrow. And until next time, may you be blessed now and always.